I think that the place where my idea of ordinary differs from, the dominant ways in which anthropologists or sociologists and even philosophers, some philosophers,
Hmm.
have looked at questions of the ordinary and the everyday, is that very often the ordinary is assimilated to the unproblematic, to something that is normalized, something
Hmm.
where it's the site of routine, it's the site of repetition, and it is absent. My argument is that it's all that, but
Hmm.
it's not just threatened from the outside. There are
Hmm.
these things where it's constantly corroding from the inside. Right? And so, in that sense, this question of the ordinary as, um, as both, as if you will, as braided with the extraordinary. It's not that there is a separate domain of the extraordinary and a separate
Right.
domain of the ordinary, right?
It would be interesting to start the conversation by, listening to you about your personal journey a bit.
Rama, my student Rama Chatterjee, who's now very, fantastic scholar of
Yes.
folklore and of thinking about new forms that mythology and folklore have taken.
Hmm.
I think she said once, and it's kind of stayed with me because it's very true. Which is that she said people don't realize that you have learned much more from your students than your students have learned from you. And I think she was really absolutely, she may not have put it quite in that way, she was put
Mhm.
it more elegantly and nicely. But I think she was absolutely right that one of the great fortunes in my life has been, in a way, the ability to work with very diverse set of students.
Hmm.
And my sense of philosophy has never been to kind of show, these are the brilliant students and these are the not so brilliant students. That's just not how I see a student or another human being. Um, so that's always been that kind of very interesting challenge to me to say, what is it that this person really, um, in the deepest of his or her heart, wants, right?
Hmm.
And I don't mean by that that they're clear about things. Oh, yes, I want to become a professor by the age of 30 or something.
Hmm.
But what is it that really keeps them awake at night, right? Thinking,
Hmm.
how do I understand something like this? Or how do I act in a situation of this kind? And that's in some ways how I've learned as much from these focus group discussions that I have with first generation college students in the slums in which I work.
Hmm.
They say things that, in the process of thinking, if you
Hmm.
challenge them with a question, which in a certain sense are very as stunning to me as, as a passage in Wittgenstein might be. So, I know it sounds like people don't believe me because
Hmm.
they think this is just a politically correct statement.
Hmm.
But it really isn't. It isn't just a politically correct statement. It's deeply, deeply true that, what I've learned is this question of how do I learn to listen to what this person would want to be saying if they really had come to their voice, right?
Hmm.
Which is why you will see that, that if you take two of my students, it's not always easy to say that they are my students, right? Because they will have very different ways of thinking, right? There'll be some imprint, but they will, they really bring their own experiences, their own thoughts, their own kind of ways of uh, moving forward. I think the only common thing would be that I'm a little allergic to very large ideological statements which are completely often groundless,
Mm-hmm.
which are made on basically because you have such a desire to come out on the right side or whatever the discourse is.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the way I think about my work and my life in a way. Um, I don't have a model of a journey. I don't think it's been, my thinking is very crab like, so it'll go in one direction very slowly. I always leave things in the middle. People have told me that, you lack that last punch, and they're absolutely right on that. But I like to think about what in the epistemology of leaving things in the middle might actually
Mm-hmm.
be. I don't know if that. Um,
If I can persuade you to tell us a little more about what was in the background, what is in the background uh, which enabled you to um, be what you are? What kind of stimulus?
I'm sure that there are childhood experiences, right? The fact that um, family is a family coming after partition. There are lots of deaths that I grew up with.
Mm,
So I was not a stranger to death.
mm,
Both in the family, in my kinship group, but also in the neighborhoods in which I grew up. It was,
mm,
many, many more deaths than I think others who probably were from more affluent households might have
mm,
actually seen. And I think that had a very great impact, even if it's not something that, it comes back very slowly to me. But,
mm,
I can't, I find it very difficult to turn away, right?
mm,
And so I fail also very often because, like when I was working after Mrs. Gandhi's assassination, I was able to work for 2.5 years in the same locality. I couldn't just turn back and say that now I've collected enough evidence, But I couldn't work in the way in which some of the lawyers work, because
mm.
for
Right.
15 years, 20 years till they actually got some conviction or some resolution in a court. That I'm sure has had an impact. It also has had an impact on my comfort level. I mean, the fact of the matter is that I'm much happier interacting with people you know in Sultanpuri and Noida and
Right.
Bhagwanpur Kila and all these places that I work in.
Mm,
I have the same sense of humor. I can also, I'm very comfortable eating absolutely mucky, terrible food. By terrible, I don't mean not tasty, but, the sort which might be picked up from the vendors. Now I've had to restrict myself as I become older, but I used to kind of, those are the things that just made me, gave me pleasure. For example, I remember even at the age of 24 when I got married, I had absolutely no idea that getting, that taking water from these guys who go around get thanda pani, baraf wala
ah,
pani, whatever,
yes.
Athane, charane, whatever the type it was. And I remember one of my major fights with my husband, first and foremost, was about the fact that I was like, I'm thirsty. Can I just get this water? And he's like, no, 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 that's very dangerous. And I looked at him totally askance and I said, why is it dangerous, right? With it. Because this was so normalized for me in one way.
Mm,
And I'm sure that those things, both the sources of comfort and pleasure, but also the sense of not being able to turn away, if you will, was very, very, very central. The other
mm,
thing which hasn't come out that much in my work, but I'm hoping the next 4 or 5 years, maybe I'll be able to do something on that, which is that I'm a very avid reader of Sanskrit texts, right? That comes out off and on, but it
yes.
hasn't come out in the kind of ways that I like it to, because I
Mm.
always get distracted by the next call on you, right? I was writing this book on destitution of thought where I would have, I wanted to just think about at least three concepts which moved across Panini and Mimamsa.
Mm.
The concept of absence, the concept of substitution, and the concept of contiguity,
Mm.
right?
Right.
And I have drafts, but I had to drop them because all this COVID-19 happened, and I again got drawn into, how to deal, how to think about that, how to get a group moving on, on
Mm.
thinking of that, and so on and so forth. So that's what I mean by very crab-like movements, that you move in one direction, and
Mm.
you sometimes have to turn direction, and I don't regret it, but I
Mm.
still think that that's one part of my life that that close friends know about it, not only
Mm.
know about it, but have been part of the discussions around that. But it hasn't yet been. I haven't been able to kind of I mean, part of it is that there's just such fantastic Indological scholarship now, right?
Mm.
Which is not too concerned about is this Indian, is this Western, and they are really, really amazing. Which means
Right.
that learning all of that is quite hard. Um, uh, right, and so those are the kinds of somewhat unfinished things. Um, yeah,
Yeah. So it seems.
that's detail.
Yes, personal experience really has an epistemological impact on the kind of anthropology one would do, it seems. That is a dictum emerging from this narrative. That the
It's, it's
personal experience will have epistemological impact.
yes, for
Um,
me.
yeah,
For
and the
me,
kind
which
of
is why when I wrote this section of the ordinary, I actually say that it is ethnography, biography, autobiography, all like together, right?
right, right.
With it, and I don't know how well that goes. I'd be curious to see what readers make of that. But that
Mhm.
was my sense. You're absolutely right that I can't make experience not count.
Exactly. So it is from there that we can go on talking about the idea of ordinary. Uh, I mean, if one has been familiar with your large trope of work, one knows that ever since 1970s, um, you have ordinary as your muse or as your problematic. It's very evident that you have concern and interest both in the idea of ordinary, be it uh, in the structure of Hindu society, the way the cognitive categories in Hindu society. You try to rummage through them and arrive at that notion of ordinary, or the ordinary which is under siege of some kind, or is hampered by forces from outside, and you notice that ordinary in those critical events, as you define those critical events as events which would change the mode of being, the way of being for a whole lot of people, right? And in today's situation, this whole period of pandemic, lockdown, and state becoming more powerful as far as regulation of ordinary life is concerned. Uh, what kind of ordinary do you envisage for us in future? What ordinary that would be?
Indeed, you are absolutely right that it's the central kind of problematic. But that was not clear to me right from the start. It's only become retrospectively clear to me, right? So I think a number of things which and where the ideas have in some ways been challenged by myself, right, and by
Hmm.
my experiences. But let me just say that in what way I think that the place where my idea of ordinary differs from, the dominant ways in which anthropologists or sociologists and even philosophers, some philosophers, have looked at questions of the ordinary and the everyday, is that very often the ordinary is assimilated to the unproblematic, to something that is normalized, something where it's the site of routine, it's the site of repetition, and it is. I've said, my argument is that it's all that, but it's not just threatened from the outside. There are these things where it's constantly corroding from the inside, right? And so, in that sense, this question of the ordinary as, as both, as, if you will, as braided with the extraordinary. It's not like there is a separate domain of the extraordinary and a separate domain of the ordinary, right? But that it's the fact that each lends mutual color to each other. It's sort of interesting that. Since this is COVID and I was so much at home, that I decided that it would be nice to become a student again. And so I registered for 2 or 3 online classes. Somewhere I wanted to learn different ways of writing, right? And what was very stunning to me was, so these were small classes, and a lot of them have, some have students from other countries, but it was very interesting to me how a pretty ordinary description of, let's say, an event in a street in a slum in Delhi initially would appear to my fellow classmates and to my teacher as somehow fantastic, And she asked me at one point, saying, "So, are you writing a fantasy?" Right? And it then occurred to me that it's really true that what is, that there is a sense in which the ordinary is always colored in a certain sense by a certain way in which the fantastic comes into that, but also that something like a statement which is made in an ordinary context. I'll give you an example. In one of my papers, which came from my work with young girls, 14 to about 20, who were HIV positive in Baltimore and Miami, and the Bronx. I was talking to this 14-year-old girl who was, no, she was then 16, but she had been 14 when she was first diagnosed with HIV. And most of the literature had assumed that teenager girls get HIV because, because their sexuality is, they don't have control over their sexuality, that they will often, teenagers tend to have one-night stands, they don't have, they don't have commitments which would allow them to just stay with the same partner, and that this frequent changes of partners actually mutates the virus into more lethal directions, right? One of the things we discovered that in the African American sample that we had, with whom I was working with some colleagues with which we were working, that a pretty large number were infected because they had been raped. And very often, not stranger rape, but,
family.
By a boyfriend of the mother, by a parent, by a stepfather, that kind of a thing, right? By somebody in the family, an uncle who was an addict, etc. So this girl was describing the fact that her stepfather had that part of the whole thing was that they were sexually, she and her sister were sexually accessible to him, right? And at one point she said, but for the sex part, he was a good dad. And it was such a stunning statement, because in a way, for her, there was both this thing that it rankled with her, knew that even at the age of 9, that there was something a bit wrong in what was going on. That even the fact that the stepfather spoiled her and her sister as compared to the brothers with gifts and with so on and so forth. And that she was never beaten up by him. She was not, there was sex, but it was not, for her, it was not like violent sex, right? And she thought of that, I mean, for her, that just became part of that ordinary expression to say, but for the sex part, he was a good dad, right? Now you begin to unravel that statement, and you begin to see the character of the ordinary for a young girl growing up in this precarious situation in an African American family, for which it is very hard to find language, because the moment you describe it, you fall into this language of absolute pathology, which falls into the fact that there is already that entire suspicion around African American families, and it falls into racist tropes and so on and so forth, right? So something that is not like said with any thunderous kind of notion about, look, what a victim I am, right? But said in this very quiet mode, becomes something which is so wounding, simultaneously as it becomes a certain way in which one would think about the uncanniness of the ordinary, right? So it, in some ways, from from things of that kind, that my idea that the and Freud clearly had that notion, right? You can't understand Freud unless you understand how the ordinary is both a place of security and solace, and a place of violence and and tragedy.
Right.
With it. I think Marx has, the same sort of a sense when he thinks about ordinary labor in the factory. When you see this same seamstress who's had to work, 3 nights on the running, right, and who dies in the end, and Engels then writes about her, right? It's that kind of way that I think my notion of the ordinary actually evolved, which has then these two things. One, how can we not see what is actually right before our eyes? Right? It's not hidden. It's not a matter of unearthing something which is given into it. And is it really just? It also doesn't lend itself to false consciousness, etc., because it's not like we actually have consciousness about it, right? It's both there and not there in the way that we relate to the world, right? Some of it is because, like I've been thinking a lot about questions of the fact that we know that in democratic societies, torture happens, right? And Coetzee's very wounding book, like Diary of a Bad Year, in some ways brings out this question of how can we tolerate the fact that democracies torture routinely, right? Or if I just go back and read slave testimonials, I cannot, it's very hard to understand how it is that, Jefferson or Washington or whatever could on the one hand proclaim all these very, this very elevating language, and yet not hear what their own slave women are saying to them. I'm not talking about political ideology. I'm saying, what is it that makes them not hear what they're saying to them, right? And that's where I think that my notion of the everyday and the ordinary has been very different, and it has also been very difficult for people to assimilate it, because they fall into the idea that this can't be ordinary, this must be ordinary, extraordinary, right? This must be because the ordinary has been distorted. But it's not like there was an ordinary and now it's been distorted. So just coming to, you said about question about COVID-19. Again, I think we fall into that language to say, oh, the world has now changed, right? Right? It hasn't changed for the poor. I mean, you see how they actually deal with it. They're like, okay, so this got so much attention because this is the disease of the rich, right? Whoever paid this much attention to the fact that every year we get dengue, every year somebody or the other is dying. And in fact, if you look at the deaths that have happened in this period, they're, probably more from previously existing conditions, right? For which the fragile arrangements that they had fell apart.
Right.
Right? And so that language itself, right, is a problem. To say, oh, now we know that things have completely changed, right? They haven't for, and really for a lot of the rich, they haven't. This is a great opportunity for them to buy real estate. The stock market is, is volatile, but they're questions really of, of this supposed puzzle that how is it that, the money that went to help retrieve dying industries went into bonuses of CEOs. That's not new, right? So in that sense, it seems to me, I wrote a short article. Deccan Chronicle was very kind to to publish about 3 articles that I had written on COVID-19. One of them was called "The New Normal as the Old Normal." Right? Basically, argue that it's not like there is a new normal, which is completely different. Depends on where you are.
But the sense of order, vis-a-vis normal, the kind of subject formation, very different kind of subjectivity is evidently coming into picture in the sense that a very different idea of death, dying in this risk society. No, none of those things.
For the middle classes, for whom, people are secure. I mean, just think about the fact that who is it who need not get out of the house?
Right?
Who is it who has to get out of the house? So the kind of risk management that they are doing is the kind of risk management to say, okay, you sell clothes on the patri, right? The migrant labor who used to buy those clothes has actually gone back to the villages. Uski demand bahut kam ho gayi hai, right? Now, if you go and you spend the whole day and you're going to sell 4 t-shirts, right? Whereas earlier you used to sell 12 or 15 in a day, right? Is it worth the risk of getting sick with COVID? Right? They are not formulating it as saying how is risk to be distributed within the household, but these are decisions they have always, I'm not saying nothing has changed, but it seems to me that, that there is a certain way in which, in which the middle classes refuse to see that at one level, the risks that the poor are being put to are the risks to save their lives. You don't have to go out and do your groceries because the guy who is packing up the groceries and who's making deliveries at home and who maybe has a mask now, or the Anganwadi worker who's been asked to go and do surveys in every household to check कि किसी को fever है कि नहीं है, who's herself living in a red zone, but has not even been provided with gloves. Forget about the fact that salary is not coming regularly into her bank, right? She can't just say, okay, I'm walking out of this job because this is too risky for me. Right? So whose lives are we portraying with our languages?
Precisely, I can recall that discussion you have on Dumo suggesting as to what sociology for India would be, and A.K. Sharan's contestation, and then Dumo's repartee. And in that line, one comes, this was sometime in 1990s, this we read from you. And then almost in the same decade or a few years later, one very interesting provocation you provide to most of us who were ready to receive, and that was about the crisis in sociology in India, right? and one begins to see that, the kind of methodological ruptures that through your discussion you try to provide, though there were various responses to that rupture, various repartees, but one feels that there is not full utilization of that rupture. I mean, methodologically, it could not, the disciplinary practice could not make much headway, in the sense that we do not find too many, for example, we do not find too many intellectual controversies as far as history of sociology and anthropology in India, or even in the larger region of South Asia is concerned. One is also reminded of someone like Elvin Goldner, who would anticipate similar kind of, if not similar, I mean, some kind of crisis in Western sociology, and he would give certain formulations. Say, for example, that whole idea of reflexive sociology, even though Bourdieu later on contested that, but certain kind of way out he provided. So I was wondering if you're continuing in that thread of discussion, if you're still thinking about that, I'm sure you must be. What kind of way forward we have? Because it seems a large chunk of those of us who do sociology and anthropology are not interested in taking benefit from the ruptures. Everybody wants to cement the ruptures and hide them, and then move on with whatever one is comfortable with.
That's a very nice way of reading that. Thank you for that. I have to think more. So I think you're referring to a paper I wrote in Economic and Political Weekly.
Yes.
And that grew out of my utter frustration as the chair at that time of sociology. We would, I would maybe formulate it a little differently today. I don't know whether the language of crisis is what I was trying to say. A crisis, let's say, is a moment of diagnosis, right? When a disease can turn, towards cure, or the patient will die, right? That's how causality defines something like crisis. So in India, let's say if Manu was to think about crisis, and I know that it's not politically correct to think from Manu, but he would think of Apad Dharma, right? And remember that he's living in this period of marauding Greek tribes and, constant warfare and, a tremendous upheaval in the milieux in which he's living, right? My problem was that I couldn't understand how it was that people had come to occupy a particular mode of doing work or doing scholarship. So, for me, the shock was something like this. Say, I would be interviewing somebody and who's coming to want to be appointed lecturer, let's say, right? And my usual policy was not to throw books at them and say, have you read this? Have you read this? It was to say, tell me something you've read which you like very much, right? Then we'll talk about that if I know that book. If I don't, you can tell me about it and we can talk about it. And inevitably, a lot of them would say, my favorite book is Malinowski. So I'd say, so what do you like about Malinowski? And they would give a little spiel about how important his theory of functionalism was, right? And I'd say, oh, that's really interesting. So then, so where do you think, so where was Malinowski doing his fieldwork? And they'd say India. So then I would say, but it says astronauts or, and they would say India, right? Then I realized that what had often happened is that in their, term papers or for their exams, they had been given a lot of prose dictated by the teacher. which had all of these things. Functionalism is this particular model, this, that, etc. But they had never had even the curiosity to open the book. And if the book was not available, the teacher had not had this thing to say, show them on a map, right? What do we mean when we talk about the Pacific? What do we mean when we see what an island society looks like? So one was this absence of the concrete, right? And the other was the fact that in some ways they thought that knowledge was about reproducing certain kind of language with which they need to have no connection whatsoever. Right? And honestly, that was a very deeply disturbing idea to me. Because all the debates had been about should we indigenize India, theory, should we this, etc., etc. Right, but we haven't said, okay, can we kind of say what is it to read for this student who is before you, right? Can I actually, and I say this, when as I said, I do these things like, the focus group interviews, focus group discussions with, let's say, first generation college goers. And I might say things like, here is a vignette for you. Okay, in your house, you're watching TV in the evening, and you hear from next door a woman screaming. And you know that her husband sometimes gets drunk and beats her up. But today she's screaming so loudly and so piteously, right, that it looks like something else is happening. What would you do? And there were some options. Would you call the police? Would you call, go over there and interview? That kind of a thing. And I was struck by how much local knowledge and thought went into their answers. Like they would say, well, I will not call the police. Why not? Because the police will come in, and all we know that what will happen is that it will end up by extracting a lot of money from the husband, who will then get more furious and attack the wife more. Okay, so would you go and intervene? The person would say, look, a man cannot do it, because the moment he does it, this guy will turn around to him and say, what's your interest? Are you having an affair with my wife? Right? The third one, and their solution was so brilliant that one of them came up with this thing to say, no, I would ask my mother, these were young people, to say, she will just go, the best thing would be for her to go with a empty dabba, right? A little bit of this thing, or a katori or something, and say, please, I'm sorry, I've run out of sugar. Can you please give me a little bit of sugar? That may interrupt something of that. So I began to think, what would be a mode of teaching in which I take that kind of example? And these were of course, they are very young people. This is more maybe more suitable when you're thinking of undergraduates, for example. And indeed, if you want to bring in people who have not had the opportunity to get proper education, or, one of the things these kids would often say in the end is, no teacher has ever talked to us like this. Right? Nobody had ever put a problem to them and said, aap kya? Right? So in one way, it is really the crisis of the everyday, right?
It is.
Right? And it's a crisis of governance, which is I see this in more sophisticated ways in the US, right? Where, we've had this struggle over the last 1 year against Johns Hopkins, who want to have a private policing, right? And we've kind of, look, we're living in Baltimore, right? This is the place where the police have been coming and killing, shooting at black people, right? This private policing may protect your students as they are, if they are white, and if they are, they look okay to them, right? But first, even if they protect your black faculty and your black students, this is not going to have an impact on the murder rates in Baltimore. Right? This is not going to protect African Americans who are living in Cherry Hill or areas of that kind. So why do we want solutions which will be really expensive solutions to basically assure parents of reasonably rich kids to say that because most murders are not happening within the campus of our university, right? It's kind of been very interesting to me as to how our education tends to evacuate experience,
Right.
and how would we bring back that question of experience? So it's a very different struggle from, let's say, what Dumont would have. That's one part. The other part has been, I wrote something with Shalini Randeria and Andrew Brandel. I don't know what we called it, but I remember what I wanted to call it, which was, which was like, why is India such a thorn in the garden of theory, right? Because despite everything, it's very interesting that that somehow when Indians genuinely produce what they think is happening in their society, right? Most people sitting in who are editors of journals, flagship journals, so to say, will try and say, but why don't you use this theory, or this doesn't quite fill this particular theory, right? And so then they produce that thing to say, oh, now it fits this particular theoretical narrative, right? But actually it doesn't, right? And so in a certain way, there's a very long history of thinking. Then you look at Hegel's comments upon the Gita, for example, on the Bhagavad Gita, for example, to say this is not really philosophy, it's religion, right? And actually for Hegel, yes, it takes him a year, to have the Gita translated into Latin, retranslated into Latin, right? From because he doesn't trust Schlegel's translation first and foremost. He then kind of relooks at it. Then he kind of talks to William Jones, etc., etc. And I'm very glad, actually, that a lot of work that I see is bringing in a certain way in which one is saying, let's kind of see what kind of what kinds of concepts were grown from this kind of soil, right? Rather than to think and this is very different from saying indigenizing theory. I'm not saying that, the Mimamsa notion of God will work if applied properly to Indian gods only. I'm saying, no, it will work if we begin to say, if there is a society that could, or a period in history when you could think about God as gods, as purely constructions of language, and you could think of absence in a way by which absence is never full absence, but that it always leaves its traces, what would it do to, to, let's say, Evans Pritchard's notions of God in the Noor, or Dinka notions of God, and in fact, in Textures of the Ordinary, which I hope you will get to read, there is a particular chapter called Crisscrossing of Concepts, where I try to show that it's not that Evan Pritchard is using any, neutral universal categories. He's setting up a standard as to say who can have a God, right? And who cannot, which is why the Noor court is God, but the Dinka God is not really God. Right? Because the Dinka don't have the right attitudes towards it. So I think we have a lot of work to do on a lot of those sets of issues, and these different people will bring very different bearings. So, the thing that I feel is that there's so much talent in India, and I really learned so much also from the vernacular writings, that to actually... I think something different will happen, and I can't figure out whether this is a very irrational hope on my part. I sort of gave an interview very recently, and I was like, it does happen that if you, if you really long for, for this to happen, then you also really begin to want to see that too. But I do think that there is a sense in which, in which new generations, they don't have to think in terms of crisis and rupture. They have to think about how to make their own experiences really count, right? And that's very hard in many ways. because you have these inane administrators who have no idea about what education might be like, who are on top of educational hierarchy.
Yes, yes.
And so they think that it's basically आपने 5 paper publish करे हैं, it doesn't matter कि, how we are going to review these papers. Are they then maximum? They will say, okay, now we will do a hierarchy of journals, and that hierarchy of journals would reproduce in a certain sense, So I think that that's the sort of questions that the answer to all the what I was calling a crisis was not to say now we will only have if you have published 5 papers, because you're putting such pressure on people at one kind of level at which they end up often, they end up plagiarizing, let's face it. They end up just reproducing words of the sort that have no ground in many ways. And so there's a lot of hard work that is required. But then there are people like you, and there are people like, I just think of this whole next generation. I think of Pratiksha, I think of, Deepak, I think about, people in places like Bombay University, Tata Institute, went out and said, no, we are going to do this together. And I think it's important to think of it not as just local knowledge, but to say, how can we make that knowledge really count?
Thinking of this idea of experience shall be counted in whatever we do, in writing, in teaching, in framing courses as well, and that you are planning to do something more elaborate about Sanskrit texts. I was reminded of your brief engagement with Punjabi kinship and where you deal with folklore, women's folklore. And I was thinking that, that domain of experience is somehow not so prominent. I mean, Sanskritic tradition has still made some way forward as far as being counted, even for the namesake, within social science ruminations is concerned. But somehow folklore remains to be looked at as archaic stuff which may or may not provide with the epistemes for any kind of intellectual utility.
I just think that there is, instead of kind of having these divisions, which are this kind of thing to say, oh, politically, how can we deal with Sanskrit texts when these were hierarchical and excluded Dalits? I mean, the other way might be to say, but the people properly to do that are people who are excluded groups, right? Women, Dalits, with it. And that to see the great entanglement between the vernacular and the Sanskritic would be, would generate a completely different theory of, completely different theory, not only of, say, religion, but of translation, of what is textual, what is a sign, what does it mean to say that signification is signless? It's not, Panini's Lopa is not Saussure's 0 degree, right? So in that sense, it seems to me that there is a really important challenge, and it'd be great at some stage to say, it doesn't matter if, if there are people who say, oh, this will not fit into, into thinking of, a flagship journal in the UK or US, right? We should create these, these journals, but we should also not assume that there's nobody in the West who is not troubled by these things, right? They are very, very good editors, and they are very good scholars who are deeply troubled by, by the kind of the need or the requirement to kind of think differently. It's equally true that part of the thing I find I find triumphalist narratives particularly troubling anyway. So when this COVID-19 happened, there was all of that thing to say, oh, anthropology has a lot to offer. And to my mind, it was like, okay, but where is it that we actually need in process, right? Where is it that I need to really understand what I don't understand? Right? So I think that's the sort of struggle for me, which is less like in terms of saying, oh, what is the grand project around which the struggle might be, but to say, what does it mean to, as I keep saying, what does it mean to say that if this is a first generation college goer, how do I make his or her knowledge something that I can bring to bear on his or her education?
It's becoming more and more relevant, the kind of philosophical orientation with which you started dealing with some of these issues, be it of epistemological significance, those cognitive categories, or even the issues of violence, suffering, and the speech through that experience of violence, silences through that experience of violence. There has been this sense of, uh, uh, engaging with existential intricacies that is prevalent throughout, and it seems more and more relevant in today's situation.
So my relation to philosophy is pretty different from Michael Jackson's, though I really like his work, I admire his work.
Hmm.
Um, I don't have any prescriptive, I don't have a prescriptive bone in my body. I can't say you should be doing this, right? Um, so for me, the turn to philosophy is not because I think philosophy can provide theory, as if anthropology didn't have theory.
Mhm.
Uh, you know, uh, um, for me, it was more like where are the impasses where require me to turn to certain texts. So I will turn as easily to, Wittgenstein or to Cavell or to Austin or to some who all of whom I love very, very much. As I might to Anand Vardhan or Gemini or, who also I love very much, or to, Krishna Suti or Krishna Baldev Ved or, um, mm, Jivananand Das, or right now I'm actually trying to read with a group Shah Hussein's poetry, which is Punjabi poetry, right? With it. And so it depends really on what, on what, um, what makes something like a turn to something integral to your project, right?
Mhm.
So there are students who are compelled with me. Like I taught this course for the last 2-3 years. Navida and I've been teaching this course on, on concepts through Hindu and Islamic texts. Right? We're trying to see what kind of ways to read original texts from, from Hindi. They can be sometimes, you know, I wouldn't say they're simpler, but they can be more, for some people, they can be more fun, like the Mahabharata. But equally, we've taken up reading, bits of Gemini Sutra, as well as a lot of commentatorial traditions on that, right? So I would just say that in order for something like this to happen, whether you turn to whether it is that I equally turn to economics. People don't realize that, but I do have a lot of work, in which I've had to master really how to think about dimensionality, how to think about numbers, how to think about, the manner in which the quantitative findings which my colleagues were finding could be given a story, or what relation they bear to, and each is because for my work on TB, I found that to be the most interesting thing, to be working with this group, which was of economists and clinicians and so on. But for my work, let's say on textures of the ordinary, I just, had to bring in my love for Wittgenstein and Cavell and Austin and Sondra, into the text, so to say, right? Because they were, they were what gave life to the text. Right?
Hmm.
think that's the question for me. What will give life to your problem, right? Rather than say, oh, do we need to have a philosophical orientation or literary orientation, other orientation, right?
Okay.
And then I would say, yes, we should provide the support for that, right? So I'm lucky that in a place like Johns Hopkins, nobody from the philosophy department comes, breathing down my neck and saying, how is it that you're teaching writings from Wittgenstein, right? There are other universities where they would say, oh, this is the property of philosophy.
Thanks a lot. It's a wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Dev. This was great.